everyone. It looks like people are still coming in, but I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for joining us today for Lighten Up, Methods for Making Your Automation Suite Leaner. We're joined by Test Automation and Service Virtualization Consultant Boz Dijkstra of On Test Automation, who will be sharing some of the strategies for de-bloating your UI tests and getting your automation suite into shape. Then at the end of the presentation, we'll be doing a live Q&A with Boz, so don't forget to submit your questions to the Q&A box at the bottom. Without any further ado, I'm going to let Boz take it away.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. Thank you very much for your introduction, Alex, and for having me at this webinar. Yes, there we go. So basically, Alex, you've got this all covered with your wonderful introduction. So without further ado, let's dive into what you've all signed up for. The question that this webinar revolves around is: are you suffering from a bloated automation suite? Everybody's doing automation nowadays, and everybody's diving into it with a lot of enthusiasm. But all too often, from what I've read from other people, what I've seen in the projects that I've been working on, that the automation suites that people build and develop can start to get bloated and messy and unwieldy quite quickly. And some of the symptoms that you suffer from when your automation suite starts to get bloated. First of all, it takes a long time to run all of your tests. So the fast feedback that you want from your tests isn't really there because it takes hours. And in some extreme cases, I've seen even more than a full day to run all of the tests that people have created. With bloated automation suites also, what I often see is that feedback from that automation suite is quite shallow. And with shallow feedback, I mean, there is some indication that something went wrong during the execution of all of those automated tests. But from your test results and from your test run result, it's not really clear what exactly went wrong. So there's no indication which part of the test or even which part of the application failed to meet the expectations setting your automated tests. It just indicates that something went wrong, and there's no really detailed information about what went wrong, and let alone what may have caused that automated test to fail. With the bigger your automation suite gets and the more unwieldy it gets, it also starts taking a lot of time and effort, and as a result, a lot of money to keep your automation suite in pace with your application development. With bloated automation suites, it takes a lot of time that's spent on maintenance of your automated tests. And unfortunately, that's something that a lot of teams and organizations and managers still don't really take into account when they're diving into automation. And what I said a little earlier, the automation, one of the big goals of automation really is shortening the feedback loop. After a developer develops a new feature, and you want to have really, from your automated test, you really want feedback as quickly as possible about the effect that the development of the code that's a result of that new development has on the quality of your application as a whole. And that's what you tend to use automation for. But if your automation suite takes hours or even days to run, that feedback loop isn't really as short as you'd like it to be. Your developers have moved on to start doing other things because they don't want to wait for all of the test results to come in. And that some automation really should give you very quick feedback about or insight into the quality of your application. With bloated automation suites that take a long time to run, that don't give you detailed and high quality feedback, which makes you have to spend more time diving into why a test exactly failed. That's not exactly what I'd call a quick feedback loop. So let's look at some of the reasons why the automation may become bloated. The first reason I unfortunately still see a lot is that people and teams and organizations still have really unrealistic expectations around automation. I'm sure we've all heard, and fortunately in the last couple of months or a year or so, things are slowly starting to look better, but there's still a lot of people, unfortunately, that go all out on automation and say all things that our testers do can be automated and should be automated. So they still believe that automation is a one-stop solution for everything regarding testing, which, as we probably know by now, it doesn't hold up. That's not the case. You can't just automate everything that's there and that's involved in actual testing. Also, all tests should be automated. So every single test that's being done, it should be automated. And if you just start adding and adding and adding tests to your automation suite, there's a high chance that your automation suite grows larger and larger over time, leaving you with something that becomes unwieldy and is not really in shape anymore. Also, I think the former two symptoms or reasons, they stem from people regarding automation as the ultimate goal. So I've seen people write very extensive statements around automation if they're doing Agile or Scrum in their definition of done, meaning we should have or we must have 100% code coverage, or all of our tests should be automated at the end of the sprint, making automation a goal in itself, which I find to be not a good idea. Instead, automation is a means to support testers in their testing efforts. So it should never become a goal in itself. If you make it a goal in and of itself, then it's something that can quickly grow out of hand, in my experience. And finally, everybody can and should write automation. Of course, it's a good idea for every tester to get involved in automation. Automation's everywhere nowadays, and it's fun, it's useful when done right. But to be honest, there's a whole lot more that testers can contribute to the development process and to software development and testing activities than just automation. And automation in itself it's a skill, it's a craft, maybe even. So it takes effort, it takes practice. It's not something you can just pick up and do for a bit and then leave it alone and turn back to in a week's time when you've got some time left. And there are a whole lot of tools out there that promise you that everybody can and should write the automation and contribute to the automation. And I don't really believe in that. And what you get then is maybe a whole lot of automation, but a whole lot of automation that's not well architected, well built, well designed, so to say. And in the end, then what starts to happen is that your automation again becomes unwieldy, slow to run, hard to maintain, and all kinds of symptoms that we've seen before. My apologies. Second reason why automation becomes bloated is more from a tool perspective. People buying or building a tool for automation and then trying to cram every single thing or aspect of the software under test that they want to test into that tool. So the nail and hammer analogy, I'm pretty sure I don't have to explain that to everybody, but there's the famous saying, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, very much holds up within the field of automation as well. But there is no one tool to solve them all. I've been in the field for 13 or 14 years now, and I've seen and used a lot of different automation tools. But so far, I haven't found a single tool that's able to do everything that we want to do as testers. So most tools do one thing or maybe two things. They do it really well. And the key to building good automation is making use of the strengths of that tool. And if you want to do something else, that's fine too, but that's probably a tool that's specifically designed to do that task instead. Don't try to find or build one tool that does everything for you, but instead collect and connect different tools that can that each have their own strength and each can do one thing really well, and that's almost always a much better solution to building an automation framework, an automation solution, so to say. And all that can be summarized in what I'd like to call framework think. I see a lot of people, a lot of efforts, a lot of questions being asked around building automation frameworks. And don't get me wrong, automation frameworks are a good thing to have, right? Because they standardize the use of automation. But the danger with frameworks, in my opinion, is that people at the start of an automation project or at the start of a software development project, they build an automation framework that's supposed to do everything from be it user interface testing, API testing, performance testing, reporting, test data management, you name it, and then trying to cram every single thing that they want to do into that framework. So they fit their testing and their automation around what the framework is able to do, instead of thinking about what's the problem they're trying to solve and finding a tool that supports the solution of that problem. So a third reason of automation becoming bloated is that I see a lot of people viewing their application from a single perspective. So, and that's also how they approach their automation. They automate everything around their application from a single point of view. And most of the time, because we as testers, we're used to looking at an application from an end user perspective. So, but unfortunately, that's also how a lot of us still approach automation. We look at it from an end user perspective, and we try to replicate what we do as an end user with our automation. And honestly, end user perspective automation is fine and it's good to have, but doing everything from an end user perspective often results in slow and hard to maintain automation. You should have some of it, But there's so much more you can do with automation than just replicating end user interaction with your system. And it's really worthwhile to dive deeper into what your application does and thinking critically about what's the best way to automate that. So even if the thing we're checking is not an end user process, we still and this comes forth from having a framework or a single tool in place too often as well. Even if the thing we're checking is not an end user process, we still approach our automation of that thing to check from an end user perspective. And at least in my experience, those tests, for example, using a tool like Selenium or Cypress or UFT maybe, or coded UI or any other user interface driven end-to-end automation tool, those are the hardest ones to write. Yet it's still for a lot of people, the entry point or the gateway drug into automation, because they're simply looking at automation as replication of the things they do as testers. They think they do the simulation of end user interaction with the system. So those three things I mentioned are some of the reasons that I think lead to a lot of bloated automation, unfortunately. Let's move on to how can we prevent ending up in such a situation. And what I think is key here is asking the right questions. I see a lot of people asking, how can I do this? How can I do that? There are a lot more important questions, in my opinion, that should be asked before you dive into how can I solve problem X with tool Y, for example. So let's take a look at those. The first question that I see that I would like to see asked much more is, do we need to automate this in the first place? So instead of automation by default, think critically about what it is that you're doing and if it really needs to be automated. So a couple of slides ago, we talked about automate all the things. Try and take a step back. From time to time and say, okay, we're spending so much time and effort on our automation, but do we really need to automate this? What people tend to forget in the process of automation, of creating automation and going for this, we need to automate all the things. That elusive end goal that they have of having automated everything. What they often forget is that creating and maintaining that automation, it also requires resources. You need to write it, you need to run it, you need to maintain it, you need to analyze the results. And what's too often forgotten in the quest for complete automation is are these things, the resources, and those resources could probably be spent otherwise as well, and maybe in a lot of cases could be spent more usefully. For example, by actually diving deep into actual testing of your application and doing things that you cannot do with automation, or maybe contributing to development or conducting reviews with end users, all things that people don't get to do because they spend so much time creating and maintaining their automation. So my advice would be manage those resources really carefully. Of course, you should spend enough time on automation, but it never is an end goal in and of itself. So be really critical about what it is that you're automating and how much time you spend on that automation. And the key question here is, for everything that you're thinking about automating, you automate something because you want information from it. You test because you want information, because you need to gather information. And with automation, the key question when you decide, do we need to automate this in the first place, is are we comfortable, and we as a tester, as a team, as an organization maybe, are we comfortable not having that information provided by this test? If you're comfortable not having the information provided by the test, I should say leave the automation for a while. Don't just blindly automate it just because you can. Automate only those things, those checks, those tests that give you business critical information. So if it's information that's not really all that critical, then maybe do something else that maybe gives you another piece of information that is more valuable than that bit of automation that gives you information that's maybe less valuable. The second question, do we need to automate this through the user interface? As I said, in the one reason for automation to be becoming bloated is automating everything from an end user perspective through the user interface. But there's, as you hopefully know, if not before today, then hopefully after this webinar, there's a lot more that you can do with automation than just replicating end user interaction with an application. And so automation doesn't have to be created from the end user perspective. Instead of doing everything from an end user perspective, try and see if with your automation you can get as close to the implementation of the thing that you're checking as possible. A little further on in this webinar, we're going to see a case study where I'll highlight some examples for a fictitious application where we see that you don't need to automate everything from an end user perspective, because the thing that you're checking may not be implemented there, may not be implemented in the user interface. And if it is implemented in the user interface, there are other ways to test it other than doing an end-to-end test with Selenium or Cypress or whatever you want. Those, as I call it, user interface-driven end-to-end automation. So firing up a browser and starting Selenium to interact with the browser, or Coded UI or Cypress. Only use those tests when you're verifying end-user journeys or sequences of actions or interactions with an application. If it's something else that you're testing, there's probably also a more effective approach to automation for that. And finally, it took me a surprisingly long while to understand this, but a user interface is just another layer in an application, and it can be unit tested as well. So you don't need the entire application to do tests that only touch a user interface. The key question here, the logic, the piece of business logic, the business rules, or the complexity that you're automating, that you're checking, really ask yourself, where's that logic actually implemented? Do we need our entire stack of layers in our application to simulate that logic or that behavior that we're verifying? The third question, do we need to run this test for every build? And again, especially those end-to-end tests, those user interface-driven end-to-end tests, they take relatively long to run. Unit tests take milliseconds. API tests maybe take half a second to a second or something like that. And those user interface tests, even the relatively fast ones, as long as they exercise your entire application stack, they take a relatively long time to run. I've seen tests that take up to 10 minutes. And then as soon as you see a test that takes 10 minutes, you know you've hit something that is highly likely to become bloated and unwieldy. This becomes even worse when you try to test everything across various browsers, various operating systems. And then the feedback loop and the time it takes your automation suite to deliver the information that you're looking for, it's becoming even longer. With those tests, there's also a relatively high chance of false positives. So tests that fail for a reason, for some other reason than there being a defect in your application under test. So maybe you have a timeout in your test, or your front-end JavaScript isn't fully done before you try interacting with the application, and you get a synchronization error or something like that. So the application in itself is fine, but still your test fails. That's what I mean with false positives. With those kind of those big heavy tests, there are just more things that need to be in sync and that need to line up in order for your test to run successfully. So for those tests, consider moving them out of your build pipeline and out of your building process. So maybe not run them for every build that you do, and just run them as an example, I mentioned here in a daily or nightly job, but maybe you just you have a build once a week, and then still, do you need to run your whole suite of tests across all browsers, across all operating systems for every build? So that's another way to make your automation suite a little trimmer. Just only execute the really critical, the really important tests for every build, and tests that can wait for a while, maybe run them less often. And the key question here is, are we comfortable deploying this build or shipping this build without the information provided by this test? And this is something different than not automating at all, but you can decide if you have some long-running slower tests that maybe do not give you highly business-critical information. Maybe you can postpone those tests for a while, deploy your build after having run quicker business-critical tests, and run those slower, less critical tests at a later point in time. And finally, do we need to check this for every operating system and every browser? I think I've covered most of this in the previous slides already. Just because you can, check it, and wonderful platforms like CrossBrowserTesting make this possible, to check everything for a wide variety of combinations of operating systems and browser types. But just because just because you can doesn't mean you should. So the more combinations you check, the longer it takes your automation suite to deliver that full set of feedback of information that you're waiting for. Really zoom in on those browsers and operating systems that your end users use. And pay some special attention to those that are giving you or your end users troubles. So maybe there's an older version of a browser that you still want to support, but that you know that it gives trouble sometimes with your application. So spend a little bit of extra time on that, and maybe spend less time on browsers or operating systems where you know everything's going to be run fine. And the key component here is what's the risk of things not working? What's the chance of things not working in a specific browser or operating system? And the key question here, is there any added value in rechecking the same test, executing the same test for combination of browser Y and operating system Z, really? Does that add any value? I've even heard Simon Stewart, the creator of Selenium, recently say that checking things across a couple of browsers and operating systems should be enough. If some things give you trouble across 2 browsers, it's highly likely that it causes you trouble in other browsers as well. So there's no need to check, and then just fail your build and investigate instead of rerunning those tests across maybe 7, 8 other different browsers and browser versions just to give information about things that you really already know. So, as I promised, a little case study. This is fictitious, but it's based on a project that I've worked on recently, where all of the symptoms that I've talked about before were really prominent over there. So they had a framework that they had an automation framework, and they really tried to cover everything with that single framework, with a single type of automated test. They really tried to do everything. So assume we have an application which is an online mortgage calculation tool. As I said, it's online, so it's a web application, and you can access it through a browser. Really, any browser that you wish. You just enter a URL and it's there. The application consists of 3 different forms which ask visitors for specific data. First, they have a form that asks people something about their household. So your age, do you live alone? Do you have a partner? Do you have children? Something like that. The second form asks you to give some information about your financial situation. So are you in a pension? Or what's your income? What's your contract? Are you self-employed? Are you on a payroll somewhere? Things like that. And the final form asks you something about the house you want to buy. So what's the asking price of the prospective new house that you're really wanting to buy? Do you have a house to sell maybe? Do you need? Are you planning for renovation? And well, all kinds of things that are of that influence the decision of a bank on whether or not they're going to give you a mortgage. After these forms are completed, you get a pro forma. So it's not an official legal calculation, but it should be correct anyway, because it's a good estimation of whether or not you're eligible for a mortgage, and how high the mortgage is that you can get, and what your monthly payment would be, for example. The way the application is built up, it has a user interface with those 3 different forms that I just introduced. When, as an end user, you enter data in these forms in your web browser, these are sent to an API. And that API communicates with the backend, where all the data is stored, where the actual calculations are being made, and where all the business logic is implemented, for example. And the API, what the API does is it transfers the data to and from the user via the web browser, via the user interface. So with this, given this application, I could come up with a variety of different test IDs. For example, I would like to know, can I successfully complete all of the forms and get a pro forma calculation? I also, I would like to check in the first form where I'm being asked about my household. Is an extra text field appearing when I'm selecting that I'm buying this house together with someone else? Because then I don't need to just specify my own income, but also the income of my partner. So if I choose the option of I'm buying this house together with my partner, I want 2 text fields to become available for income specification instead of just the one. The third one is, as I said, I'm given a pro forma calculation at the end. Is that result correct, given the data that is supplied? That's also something that I'd really like to know as a tester, because that's important to the end user. And the fourth test ID that I have is, does this all work on the 3 most used operating systems, whichever they are, and all 5 most used browsers that the users of our application use. So, and it's really easy to say, if we have an automation framework in place, and to just check all of these things with using our wonderful end-to-end user interface driven automation framework. So in theory, this all works. This all works fine. You can really, you can actually check all of the things, all of the test IDs that we saw before, using those user interface driven end-to-end automation frameworks, solutions, tools. However, that doesn't mean that it's a good ID, and actually, because of all of the reasons that I've just specified, that's automating everything from a single perspective, with tests that are relatively slow, that are hard to write, take a lot of maintenance, and that slow down your feedback loop and that give you shallow feedback. So how to do how I would approach this instead, and what would result in a much leaner and faster automation suite. And the question is, where's the logic that we want to verify in each of these different test IDs? Where is it actually implemented? So for the first test ID, can I successfully complete all of these forms and get a pro forma calculation? For this one, you really need to do this end to end. You're going through a number of different screens, a number of different forms, which means at least 3, but probably more interactions with an API. You're really simulating an end user journey, as we call it. They firing up an application, filling out all of these different forms, communicating with the backend on every form submit, or maybe even on every text field or button that's clicked, an API call is being done. And you really want to know, as an end user, can I interact with this application in a way that gives me, at the end, feedback about whether or not I'm eligible for a mortgage, and can I see the pro forma calculation? This is something that it's a good idea, because you're really simulating what an end user would do to use an end-to-end test. Again, for example, using a tool like Selenium or Cypress or Coded UI or UFT maybe, to do this kind of testing. Second test ID. Does an extra text field appear when I select I'm buying this house together with my partner? Again, it would be, on first instinct, you might say, we're using the user interface, so we fire up a browser with you, and we check whether the extra text field appears. But as I said, you don't need to, for this interaction, just a single click on a screen, you probably don't, the API is probably not invoked, the backend's not used. This is just some logic that's implemented just in the front end, and just in the user interface layer of your application. So there's no need to invoke, to fire up all of the other layers of your application just to check whether an extra text field appears when you select I'm buying this house together with my partner. As I said a couple of slides ago, you can unit test your user interface just as you can with all of your layers. With the user interface, in the end, it's just a code base as well, so you can do unit tests on this as well. And A test ID like this is something that you probably can cover with a unit test on your user interface layer. So by all means do that, and don't use an end-to-end test to check this piece of logic that can be reasonably covered with a unit test. The third one is the result of the pro forma calculation correct given the data that is supplied. Now, you don't know what this actual application look like, but with well-designed modern web applications, it's highly, highly unlikely that any of the business logic or the business rules that's invoked when you do a calculation like this, that it resides in the user interface. So why use the user interface to check this piece of logic? It's highly likely that this business logic or these calculations, they reside somewhere in the backend. So, but I'm almost certain that with a well-designed web application, that this piece of logic is exposed through the API, and the user interface is just, between air quotes, a fancy way of making that data, that logic that's exposed through the API, accessible to an end user via browser. So these calculations can so often be done at the API level, maybe even at the backend level, but quite certainly via the API level. And API tests are really are very often much faster than tests via the user interface. So by all means, check under the hood, check what's happening in your application when you interact with it, and try and see if you can invoke an API instead. A really interesting blog post that I read recently. It's from last year, but I just read it recently. It's from Chris McMahon, and he says if you go through the same screens in the same sequence, just with different sets of test data, different combinations of input and output parameters, there's a really high chance that there's a more efficient way to test it than through the user interface. So by all means, take some time and effort to dive deeper into how your application is layered, is made up, and see if there are more efficient ways to test things than through the user interface. And the final feature, does this work on all 3 most used operating systems and all 5 most used browsers? So before I told you a little about mixing and matching and focusing on really the most important ones, and the browsers and operating systems that are giving you troubles. For this is also something that you can do just on the user interface. If you're testing cross-browser, the problems that you're finding with cross-browser testing, they all reside in the user interface, or almost all of them reside in the user interface. So make an effort, try and find a way, if you can isolate the user interface from the rest of your application, and as you will see, that works wonders for your feedback loop, because it's suddenly much easier to control the state of your application, to control your data. So if you don't need the API in the backend, your test execution will become much, much faster. And so that's another fine way of shortening that feedback loop and getting the information you want out of your automation suite much, much faster and in a much more reliable way. So that concludes what I have to contribute today. This sheet really contains the 4 questions I think you should be asking if you notice my automation suite is getting bloated, or if even better, if you're starting out on your automation journey and you want to prevent your automation suite from becoming so slow, and so bloated, and so unwieldy, so hard to maintain. Really make an effort to ask those questions that we've seen before. So that leads me to say thank you very much for your attention. If there's any questions, feel free to ask them right now. If we don't get to all of the questions, or if you have something else you want to ask or want to discuss with me, you can contact me through any of these via my email, on my website, on testautomation.com, via Twitter or via LinkedIn. I'd be happy to answer any or all of your questions. Thank you very much. Are you there, Alex? I can't hear you.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I was on mute. I was just saying, thank you so much. I think everybody here learned a lot today about, when we should be using Selenium testing and testing at the UI level, and when it's better to test at the API level, or maybe, skip automation together in those instances where it might not be the right fit. So as you said, we're going to segue into the Q&A portion. And so you can ask Boz some of your burning questions right now if you want to just drop it into the Q&A box. And like you said, if you either we don't get to your questions, or if you think of something later, feel free to get in touch with us at SmartBear, or get in touch with Boz at any of the places that he gave you to reach out, either through his email, LinkedIn, or Twitter. So I think that we have a few to get started. So if you want to start answering some of those questions, Boz, you can go right ahead.
Okay, I just pulled up the Q&A window. So let's try and answer them in chronological order. That's more than fair. Oleg asks, in your experience, what automated UI checks have you seen in, for example, an e-commerce web application that were valuable, and what valuable information did it provide? With e-commerce is quite specific, and there are a lot of things that are the things that I think you should need that you need to focus on are the things that bring in the money in the end. So for every build or every change, I want to make sure that my end user can still register as a client, that they can still put items in their cart, that they can still perform a checkout, so that they can still complete the whole order process. For example, again, focusing on an e-commerce application, because that's what bringing in the money. Maybe you also get a lot of money from affiliate programs or from ads, so you really want to make sure that those still work as well. There are some other things, for example, an online chat or a video function that you may want to leave out of your critical automation path of your daily build, but that might still be very important to you, but maybe not so important that it should break a build. So those are some examples of UI checks. Those end user journeys or flows that really bring in the money. So I would really start focusing on those. I hope that answers your question. So if not, please let me know, and I'll try and find a better or an extended answer for you. Shelly asks, what if the result is not displayed correctly on the UI? I assume, it's not really clear from this test, that you have a bit of data that's coming from a backend system, for example, via an API, at which point in the application it's still correct. So the API displays or presents the data, the numbers, the fields correctly, but it's not rendered correctly on the UI, at the UI point. So in those cases, for those kinds of tests. So assuming that my API is presenting the data correctly, those things you can do with UI level unit testing just as well, by mocking out the, just using mocks for what's returned by the API, and using your user interface to say, given that my API presents this and this and this bit of data, check if my UI still displays it correctly, and if not, fail the build. So you don't really need an end-to-end test for that. It's highly likely that it's also possible to use a user interface layer unit test for that. Next one is Michael, who asks, thank you for your presentation. Well, you're welcome. What tools are on your shortlist? That's a trick question. I don't really have any tools on my shortlist. I have a couple of tools that I have used regularly in the past that I really like. Some examples are Selenium, actually. I really like Selenium. And for API testing, I use Rest Assured a lot. But in the end, it's not really important. Asking about what tool to use is answering the how question of automation. How should I automate this? And the more important questions are, why automate this in the first place, or why should we do automation in the first place, and what should we automate? And that's what I hope I've covered in this webinar. That it's much more important to decide first what to automate and what to automate, and what's the most effective approach to automation. And once you've answered those questions, then it's really only a matter of picking a tool that solves the problem at hand. And that really depends on the situation and on the environment, on what your developers are using, what fits in the infrastructure and architecture of your application on the test, what programming languages are used in the organization that you're working in, for example. So that's really it's a good question, but it's a question that's often asked a little too early about what tool to use. Anshul says, how to get on with API testing? Wow, that's a really broad question. There are many good resources on how to get on with API testing out there on the internet. I know that Alan Richardson, for example, has written a good book about API testing, where he also introduces a couple of tools. I know a lot of people in the blogging sphere that write a lot about API testing, so I would really try and see if you can find some blogs. I've written a couple of my own as well, but there are many others that have written introductions to specific tools, how to find out if you can do something with API testing. Now that something else comes to mind, Katrina Clokey has a wonderful API testing pathway on her site. I think it's katrinatester.blogspot.com off the top of my head. And she has a wonderful list of resources that can help you start working with API testing. Next question, Erin. What would you say is a short or healthy test suite runtime? Oh, wow. I'd say it depends on how often if it's a test suite that runs with every build, I say keep it under, ideally under 5, but at most under 10 minutes, because not just you as a tester, but developers tend to start doing other stuff after, say, more than 10 minutes, just after a cup of coffee and a smoke maybe. So it would be ideal to have a test suite that's run on every build or on every commit to be finished within, say, the amount of time it takes you to grab a cup of coffee and maybe go out for a smoke. So, and in most times, I'm not a smoker, but I think that's around 5 to 10 minutes. Next question is from, I don't know, how are we in time-wise, Alex?
We're doing fine. You have time to answer the last 3 questions if you'd like.
Okay, I'll try. I'll try. So Anshul asks, what is the benefit of integration testing or API and databases and web services over Selenium, and how to get started with it? The big benefit of integration of API level testing, web service testing, is that it's once you get into it, it might be a little harder to get started with because it's less visible to you as a tester, or because it doesn't really reflect what you do as an end user with your application. But once you get started, the benefits is that there's a lot less moving parts. API tests generally run a lot faster and are a lot easier to write than, for example, Selenium tests. Ideally, you should find the right mix of both and of all types of tests. But one of the big benefits of API testing, why I love API testing so much, is that it covers a much broader scope than unit tests, and it's a lot faster to write and to run than those end-to-end Selenium tests, for example. Second to last question. Oh, there's one more coming up. Second to last question from Eduard. What way of reducing test automation would you suggest for a chatbot project? Question answer dynamic flow. Oh, wow. That's not something I've done yet so far. So I'm afraid I can't really give you an answer just off the top of my head at the moment. I'd really have to dive somewhere deeper into, or maybe I could hit you up. I know a couple of people that have done chatbot development and testing. I could connect you with those instead of just giving you an answer that runs a high risk of not being really valuable to you. So if you want me to set you up for that, let me know. Nicolas, he asked, something you didn't focus on during the presentation is about configuration or activation or deactivation of features. Do you have any solution or advice to manage that? Again, I'm not off the top of my head. I assume you're referring to feature toggles and turning on and off features on demand. I'm not sure about the direct connection with automation or with automated tests in that case. So, and I'd be happy to discuss that in some more detail, but I need some extra information from you. Are we at the end of the time already, Alex?
Yes, I think we're going to wrap it up. The last question, if you would like to get in contact with Boz, you can do so through the contact information he's provided to you. As I said, we'll also be sending out an email with the recording of the webinar. So for the person that said that they came in a little bit late and asked if the slides will be available, if you had registered for the webinar, you will be receiving an email next week with that. And again, feel free to get in touch with either of us with any more of your questions if you think of them after this, or if you had the one that we didn't get to now, but we are at the end of our time here. So thank you again so much, Boz, and thanks for answering everyone's questions and doing a great presentation for us today.
Thank you very much, Alex, for having me. And thank you, everybody who took time out of their day to attend this webinar. And I hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.